It's Friday, March 7th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, and before we get going, just a word of warning, there is going to be some explicit language in this episode. You saw the title. You get it. But today on the show, the enshittification of America. Donald Trump this week made a series of practically inexplicable about-faces on his biggest stances. He went back and forth on his tariffs. He's threatening to sanction Russia all of a sudden. He's starting to break with Elon Musk among his cabinet secretaries, and he's firing tens of thousands of employees who take care of veterans, on top of everything else that he's done since he took office, leaving many people asking, what is he doing, and is this part of an actual playbook? And to help answer that last question, my guest today is writer, author, journalist, and tech activist Cory Doctorow, who invented the term enshittification to talk about why social media has gotten so bad, but we talk about using this term with tech billionaire Elon Musk at the helm and how it's being applied to the U.S. government. Now, no headlines this week because the show is essentially just a lot of in-depth headlines, and there is a lot to talk about, so let's get to it. This week, Donald Trump has spent a lot of time flip-flopping on some of his biggest and what seemed to be his most rock-solid stances, putting tariffs in place, praising Russia, backing veterans, and allowing Elon Musk to have his essentially unlimited support. And there's been so much back and forth that it's starting to wear on Americans. Here's how CNN's chief pollster Harry Enton put it.
This 46-day stretch that the Trump presidency has gone on has the most number of searches for Trump and chaos on record. The American people are seeing this. They think that Donald Trump is like Butters in South Park. He is Professor Chaos. That is what is going on. The American people at this particular point are going, what is happening here? They are seeing Trump and they are associating him with the word chaos.
So, of all the characters to compare Trump to, Butters is a pretty good one for those of you who watch the show. For those of you who don't, I'm really sorry about that reference. You're not going to get it. But the point here is that people are feeling the chaos, and this week didn't make it feel any better. And let's start with the biggest thing, Trump's tariffs. So Trump announced he was putting tariffs back on Canada and Mexico this week after a month-long pause ran out. And for those of you who don't remember, these are the 25% tariffs across the board on Mexican and Canadian goods, with tariffs on Chinese goods doubling to 20%. And just a quick refresher here on tariffs. Tariffs are taxes or fees that are paid on imports from other countries by American companies who import those goods, who then pass those costs on to consumers. And tariffs are generally used to help protect domestic and American businesses, and in the view that Trump has, to create American jobs or force American companies to stop using imported goods. The problem with that is that's not how supply chains work anymore. Things are just too globalized, and tariffs don't actually save jobs. When economists from Harvard, the University of Zurich, and the World Bank looked at the Chinese tariffs that Trump put on China during his first administration, they found that the tariffs were self-defeating for the American side and neither raised nor lowered U.S. employment. So they didn't do anything at all except for make things more expensive. And I've talked about how Trump talked up these tariffs in the midweek episode this week, which honestly I'm not really sure how well I explained that because it was 5 a.m. when I got done editing that episode. But if I didn't do a very good job, Trump was essentially asking Americans in his speech this week to bear with him because he knew things would get worse under these tariffs, given that the same day he was giving that speech, the Federal Reserve in Atlanta was predicting a coming recession, which they're calling a Trump session. And now, like Wednesday, I'll say it here too, Atlanta's numbers don't fully line up with the other Federal Reserve offices around the country, but Atlanta's Fed is generally considered to have the best prediction model for these things. So when they say it, people get nervous. And then just hours after talking up those tariffs during his speech last week, Trump carved out another month-long pause for just the auto industry, for just Canada, because so much of the auto industry crosses into Canada and also Mexico, which is why just a day later, he put a full pause on Mexican tariffs, and then just hours after that, he paused the Canadian tariffs across the board again. And for those of you feeling just a little bit dizzy right now from these 180 to 360 degree turns, well, this episode is brought to you by the good folks over at Dramamine. I'm kidding, but it really does feel like we should be taking some sort of anti-dizziness medication because it is only going to get worse throughout this episode. Here's how Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau talked about the tariff back and forth this week.
Foreign Affairs Minister yesterday called all of this a psychodrama. How do you characterize it?
Thursday.
Yes, just an average day of not knowing what the world's largest and most powerful economy is going to do at any given moment, because just 24 hours after Trudeau said this, Trump said today that he might put new tariffs on dairy and lumber from Canada, which would harm American farmers and the housing and construction industry. Now, this back and forth on tariffs, which Trump still likes, by the way, he likes tariffs because he sees them as punishing other countries who he thinks aren't giving the U.S. a good deal, and despite evidence, continues to believe that tariffs will help Americans and American industry, which is why Trump's Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who Trump basically threatened at his speech this week to make tariff happen like it was fetch from Mean Girls, well, Bessent said in a State of the Economy speech this week that the American dream isn't about access to cheap goods, which, sure, but it is about being able to afford things like a house or a car or a bag of coffee that wasn't $30 when it was $10 a month ago, and not being forced to listen to a guy who's worth nearly $750 million to tell you to suck it up when you go to the grocery store. Anyway, the worries over the tariffs and prices are beginning to worry Trump's biggest supporters, like Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, and he's Kennedy but not of those Kennedys, who said this on Fox News this week.
Does it need improvement, and where?
I think President Trump, on economics and otherwise, is doing very well. But you remember the old saying, the danger of rising high is that the air gets thin. I'm worried about the tariffs.
Yep.
I'm not saying that tariffs are going to cause inflation. President Trump did them in his first term, and they didn't. I'm saying that we just don't know. We're in very obscure territory. We're in unsure.
And he's right. Inflation was the number one reason people said when they were asked why they voted for Trump. Now, the second reason was that they thought he was a good businessman and was good for the economy. Again, despite having 6 different businesses go bankrupt since 1991. But when Trump was pressed by one of his biggest cheerleaders, Maria Bartiromo, over at Fox Business about why he would undercut the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement trade deal that he brokered in his last term, here's how that exchange went.
But I asked you about this before, and I know you told me when I asked you, I said, you did use USMCA, you put this together. Yeah. And yet then you come back and you change it up with these tariffs, and you said to me at that time, I did it because I can. I put an amendment in there, and I said in 6 years I can change it. But I think CEOs want to see predictability. They say, look, I have to speak with shareholders. I've got to make plans for CapEx spending. I can't if it's 20% one day and then it's off for a month and it's 25%. Yeah. So can you give us a sense of whether or not we are going to get clarity for the business community?
Well, I think so. But, the tariffs could go up as time goes by, and they may go up. And, I don't know if it's predictability. I think
so. That's not clarity. No,
which in the end is Trump going kind of mask off here. He likes tariffs because he likes sounding tough. But we've already seen job growth slow and unemployment start to rise, which is not clarity. The latest job numbers came out today and found that new jobs missed their target by about 25,000 jobs, and unemployment went up by 0.1%, which isn't a lot, but over the entire economy, that's not great. And those numbers likely don't take into account the full extent of the federal job cuts that have taken place under Doge and Elon Musk, but hold on to that because we'll come to that at the end. Now, next, Trump did a pair of about faces on foreign policy this week. The biggest is he's now talking about putting large-level sanctions on Russia, saying on social media, based on the fact that Russia is absolutely pounding Ukraine on the battlefield right now, I am strongly considering large-scale banking sanctions, and tariffs on Russia until a ceasefire and final settlement agreement on peace is reached, which he said in all caps, and then telling the two countries, get to the table right now before it's too late. And then here's how he said it in the Oval Office just this morning.
President Putin is bombing Ukraine.
Yeah.
Do you still believe him when he tells you that he wants peace?
Yeah, no, I believe him. I think we're doing very well with Russia. But right now they're bombing the hell out of Ukraine. I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine. And they don't have the cards. As you know, we're meeting in Saudi Arabia on sometime next week, early. And we're talking, I find that in terms of getting a final settlement, it may be easier dealing with Russia, which is surprising because they have all the cards. I mean, they're bombing the hell out of them right now. And I put a statement in, a very strong statement. Can't do that. Mr. President, we're trying to help them. And Ukraine has to get on the...
So the back and forth here. Is he going to harm Russia? Does he have a better chance of reaching some sort of a deal with Russia? Does he like Ukraine? Does he not care about Ukraine? It is so confusing. And it's also a weird turnabout given that Trump has been leading the charge to bring American conservatives closer in line with Russia, which has largely worked. The Financial Times looked at numbers from the World Value Survey and found that when it comes to values put on a scale, an XY axis, of wanting more or less international cooperation over being liberal or conservative, the American right was way down in the bottom right-hand box, which was anti-cooperative and more conservative, which in this case means more rigid and authoritarian. The U.S. right was in line with Russia, was just behind Turkey, and was way more to the right than China. So for Trump to break, not just with what he said in the past, that's something he does frequently, but also with his own voters, is very, very weird, and seemingly start to care about the harm being done to Ukraine is equally as strange. Also on foreign policy this week, Trump said he sent a letter to Iran to restart nuclear negotiations, which was this huge 180 for years now, nearing 15 years. Trump has called the deal that President Obama brokered with Iran and international organizations to monitor Iran to become a nuclear energy country while also making sure that they didn't build some sort of nuclear weapon, a really bad deal. He said it was one of the worst deals in American history. He pulled out of it during his first term. President Biden tried to restart it during his term, and Trump maligned that on the campaign trail over and over. Now, the reason Trump doesn't like this deal and doesn't like the idea of Iran having any sort of nuclear capability was because Israel and the Christian right have been putting a lot of pressure on him and Republicans not to allow Iran to have any nuclear capability out of fear that Iran would build some sort of a weapon or a bomb and then use it against Israel. And that's not an unfounded fear, mind you. Iran has said as much about wiping Israel off the map. It's just that Democrats in the past and most of the international community currently would rather be able to keep tabs on Iran and have input on them getting nuclear power rather than having to spy on them and also allow Russia or China to fill that gap so that Iran will become a nuclear nation, because it's not if, it's when and how and who helps them. But nonetheless, Trump reaching out to the Iranian government, who, by the way, hired an assassin to kill him, is a move that has absolutely got the rest of the world and a lot of his supporters scratching their heads, to say the least, and many of those folks overseas reaching for their speed dials to call their closest allies to figure out what to do next, because no one knows where the U.S. stands on a thing that could spark nuclear war, and given how Trump is talking about Russia, no one knows whether Trump would align himself with Russia and the U.S. with Russia when it comes to Iran and nukes. Now, speaking of what comes next here and about war, let's talk about the next big about face. Trump said during the campaign trail, during his first presidency, in interviews in this presidency, that he loves veterans. And they love him back. And frankly, they do. According to Pew Research, veterans voted for Donald Trump in this election nearly 2-1, 61% to about 37%. 1 in 5 people arrested for storming the Capitol on January 6th was a veteran, and the Military Times found that about 15% of the January 6th pardons went to veterans. But it turns out that when Trump said he would always take care of veterans, he just meant those folks in that way, because this week the administration said it was set to lay off more than 83,000 VA employees. Here's how the Secretary of the VA, Doug Collins, put it in a video he put up on Twitter.
Our goal is to reduce VA employment levels to 2019 in-strength numbers, roughly 398,000 employees, from our current level of approximately 470,000 employees. Now that's a 15% decrease. We're going to accomplish this without making cuts to health care or benefits to veterans and VA beneficiaries. VA will always fulfill its duty to provide veterans, families, caregivers, and survivors the health care and benefits they have earned. That's a promise.
Yeah, there's just no way that's going to happen, because in 2023, the director of healthcare for the Government Accountability Office, the person who looks at healthcare needs in agencies across the country, said that the VA needs more staff, not less. And the VA was already working on hiring more care providers for things like mental health, community outreach, so veterans can get care outside the VA when they need it, and making sure the VA can hire and retain new employees. None of those things are going to be helped by a 15% cut in staffing. And this has obviously left a lot of veterans feeling betrayed by a man they put their trust in. Here's how Eric Rodriguez, an Iraq War veteran who came home and went to work at the VA and then watched his colleagues get fired by email, put it during a press conference earlier this week.
Crashing staff, crushing unions, and selling out the VA for what? So billionaires can make more money while veterans sit on wait list. Worse, they'll get no treatment. Our president was asleep while Musk was at the wheel. Do you know what happens to a serviceman when they fall asleep when they're on duty? Veterans don't trust him. He's not one of us.
And you can hear how emotional this is for him, and it is for a lot of people right now who are confused and understandably upset by the seemingly random harm being done to a group of people who thought if there was anyone Trump would back, it would be them. But as of now, it looks like those cuts are going forward. And on cuts, let's go to our last point here, which is Doge, because Trump held another cabinet meeting this week, this time behind closed doors. He plans to hold these every 2 weeks, which is a lot more often than presidents usually hold these meetings. But it was here that he started to break with Elon Musk, reining in some of his power as Musk was in the room. So according to Politico, Trump made it clear that secretaries of the departments are in charge, not Elon Musk. Writing on social media, as the secretaries learn about and understand the people working for the various departments, they can be very precise as to who will remain and who will go. And Trump said the relationships between everybody in that room are extraordinary. Now, that last part there, not something you say unless you feel like you need to reassure people that things are fine, and they very much were not in this meeting, because according to the New York Times, the latest cabinet meeting was explosive, as they called it. Musk yelled at Secretary of State Marco Rubio for not firing enough people, even though Rubio has fired more than 1,000 people. Rubio yelled back at him. Trump tried to defend Rubio and then made fun of Musk's slobby uniform of a T-shirt and hat. And then Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy had a tense exchange saying that Doge was firing employees. saying, "I have multiple plane crashes to deal with, and now your people want me to fire air traffic controllers?" And it was clear here that Trump saw that things felt out of control, so he told his secretaries that Musk wasn't as in charge as he's made out. And this is a pretty big change after Trump threw his public support behind Musk at his speech earlier this week and during last week's cabinet meeting when he kind of made them all applaud for Elon Musk and said he would fire them if they had problems with Musk. So now it's unclear for these cabinet secretaries and the employees who are waiting to see if they're on the chopping block, if they're still going to be on the chopping block, not to mention the employees who have been fired, who these secretaries might have to and have been rehiring. Now, people tend to look at these back and forths in a couple ways. First, there are the people who think that Trump is playing some kind of 4D chess game, that he's got some grand art of the deal, long-term idea, and that he's playing other nations and Democrats and Americans, maybe who voted for him, maybe who didn't, like a bunch of fiddles. I don't tend to think that. There's not a lot of evidence of that, given what we know from his first term. The next way to look at it is what we're seeing here is the rubber really meeting the road. The shininess of Trump's flurry of executive orders, the pace that he was setting, the lofty goal setting is all colliding with the real world. We are 7 days out from a government shutdown. People are angry and confused, both in his administration as the secretaries start to get into their departments and on the ground among American voters, even those who voted for him. The impacts of the tariffs and the government layoffs are just now starting to show up in the economy, and people know that there's a lot more on the way. Essentially, it's the Enshitification of the U.S. government, which gets us to my guest this week. Cory Doctorow is the inventor of the word Enshitification, along with being a journalist, author, and activist with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He joins me this week to talk about what Enshitification is and why something normally used to talk about why Facebook is so bad now can actually be used to talk about the U.S. government right now.
Let's start with just explaining what Enshitification is. It will likely be a new concept to a lot of the listeners of this show. I am not new to it, but let's have you explain it.
Well, for about 23 years now, I've been an activist with the Electronic Frontier Foundation working on digital human rights. And so for all that time, I've been sort of talking to people, who may use computers, but for whom the importance of tech policy fights is just like not immediate enough to care about. And so I spent a long time trying to get people to care about this stuff. And I came up with a word that has a dirty word in it, Enshitification. And it turns out that the minor license for profanity is exactly what this needed to kind of tip it over from just a thing that a few wonks like me cared about to something that has really got some broad currency. And so in the Enshitification framework, we see tech platforms decaying in a kind of common way. First, they're good to their end users, and the end users pile in and they find a way to lock them in, whether that's through something like Apple locking you into a hardware and software ecosystem, or Facebook locking you in because all your friends are on Facebook and they're there because you're there, and it's really hard to all agree on where to go next. Once you're locked in, the platform can treat you worse. And they don't do that because they're sadists. They do it because they have ways to make money by making things worse for you, by making things better for business customers. And so that might be publishers or advertisers or app makers. And things get worse for you, but better for them. They pile in. And because it's hard for you to leave, you don't leave. And they become dependent on your business. There's a underappreciated aspect of competition law that monopolies are bad, but this other thing called a monopsony, which is like when you have a powerful buyer, not a powerful seller, are also really bad. And they're a lot easier to create than a monopoly, right? If you're a publisher and 20% of your books are sold through Amazon, in some ways that might as well be 100%, because if you had a 20% drop in sales, you'd go out of business. And so Amazon gets an enormous amount of leverage just by being one important customer. And so they form monopsonies in respect of their business customers and monopolies in respect of their customers. or their end users. And then they start to make things worse for everyone. And the platform turns into a pile of shit. And while that's like an external kind of account of what's going on, enshittification is also a way of talking about what happens inside the firm and why it's happening.
Right.
So this is all downstream of digitalization. Right? Once a platform is digital, once a business is digital, the rules can change really quickly. Facebook can go from saying we will never spy on you to spying on you, right? And they can do that just by retooling stuff in the back end. They don't have to change things that they've already shipped to you. Nurses in America are mostly hired through one of 3 gig work platforms now that hospitals use. And the largest of these, ShiftMed, uses credit reports to determine whether a nurse owes a lot of credit card debt. And if they do, they're offered a lower wage for their shift. And like that, because you're more desperate, right? And that's not something that's hard to think of. It's just not possible to do manually, right? It's a thing that requires digitalization. And so I call this thing where the rules change, the prices, the wages, the costs, the search ranking, the recommendation criteria, where they change for every user every time they interact with a service. I call it twiddling, because they're just like twiddling the dials on the back end. And twiddling is something you only get with digitalization. If you've ever seen Penn and Teller do the cup and balls routine with transparent cups really slowly, you'll know that a cup and balls routine is not complicated. It's just done fast and smoothly, right? And a computer lets people do very simple, brute simple, terrible tricks really smoothly and really quickly in ways that allows firms to move value from end users to business customers back to end users, back to themselves, and ultimately collapse the platform. And then as to why the twiddling is happening now, because twiddling has been potential for digital platforms since technology started. We've had digital companies for 20 years, and they used to make better services. It's not like Google used to suck. Google sucks now, and it was good before. Facebook was a fun place to hang out with your friends, and now it sucks. The reason they suck now, and they all suck now, is that all the things that would have punished them for benefiting themselves at your expense have gone away.
One of the things I'm really curious about is the principles of enshittification in the real world, because with Musk now in charge of all of these things that he's doing, which are pseudo tech, whatever, right? Are you seeing the beginning stages, or maybe the middle stages, depending on how dire things are, of the ideas and processes of enshittification in the government now? Because it seems to be the only way Musk knows how to operate things like this.
Well, enshittification is definitely closely related to other extractive practices like private equity roll-ups. And private equity likes to lard a lot of performative complexity in its descriptions of how it does its work. But if you've ever seen the Sopranos bust out episode, right, where they take over a business, borrow a bunch of money against it, stiff the suppliers, and then leave as the business collapses, that's private equity, right? It's what they did to Red Lobster and the Olive Garden and Toys R Us and Sears and so on.
Every local newspaper, yeah.
Yeah, you're taking something that like accumulated a bunch of value over a long time scale, and you're just removing all the value as quickly as possible and running away before anyone notices. And you see this in like palliative care homes and in senior centers and just all kinds of places where you would really not like to see it, pet grooming and funeral parlors and everywhere. And Musk is pursuing what looks like a private equity bust out, right? He's taking the value that was accumulated very slowly, taking the buffers that were very carefully husbanded, right? The cash buffers, the resource buffers, the staff buffers that were built up so that there's a margin of safety against unexpected outcomes. And he takes all the slack out of the system, and it'll run for a while, right? Because the slack is there against unexpected or higher than normal or seasonal variations in the demands on the service. And so, yeah, when nothing's on fire, you can take a lot of money out of the emergency resources management systems, and there's no fires to fight. And so it looks like they weren't doing anything. There's a law, not a law, a principle called Chesterton's fence, which is that you should not remove a fence until you can explain what it's there for. because just because you can't figure out why the fence is there now, it doesn't mean that there isn't whatever a herd of buffalo that ride through once a year that fence is keeping from trampling the crops, right? And Musk is not interested. He's one of those people that Chesterton, it was G.K. Chesterton who came up with Chesterton's fence, that Chesterton was addressing, someone who has no curiosity and who has the kind of arrogance of thinking that if they can't imagine a reason for a fence to be there, that means that there is no reason for a fence to be there. And, he is a mix of dumb and reckless and self-serving, and it's hard to know which is which, but it may be that he just doesn't care. It may be that he's too arrogant to want to care. It may be that he lacks the impulse control. In some ways, Musk, he has the affect of like a live streamer who's, broken into a missile silo. And in the chat is every weird chud from 4chan going like, push that button. No, push that button. And his 4chan chat is like the America First Institute and the Heritage Foundation and all these, creeps, many of whom, like me, have spent their whole lives delving into weird esoteric systems of the state and of the economy and thinking, oh, if I could change that one thing. Like, I recognize that, the version of that like you saw in the Biden administration was much more benign. In July 2020, Biden issued a 72-point memo on antitrust. And it enumerated 72 existing powers that the administrative agencies had to do antitrust that didn't require any further congressional approval. And they used that as like a punch list. And they did like all 72 of those things in the following 4 years. That was not assembled by like one guy spitballing, right? That was like consulting all the, tube feeding activist weirdos like me who have been obsessing about 150-year-old meatpacking laws and how they could be used to deconsolidate the meatpacking sector. And, the difference here is that these guys are much weirder. Their theories are much worse, right? They're like, presidents don't have to listen to courts, which is just like a wild thing. And they want to do things that are much worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the thing that I think about too is that when we talk about intradification, it does seem like we're in the phase right now with the federal government that is making things worse for the end user, but I don't know who it's making things better for on the back end.
Oh, contractors, beltway bandits, right? I mean, and also rich people who enjoy tax breaks and regulatory relief. But, the American Prospect did a great piece called, "Hey, Elon, we found the $2 trillion." The entire American federal workforce is 4% of the federal budget, right? If you cut the workforce in half, you will cut the federal budget by 2%, right? Whereas the private sector contractors who provide all kinds of different services from highway maintenance to, a ton of what the DOD is supposed to be doing, all coming out of private contractors. If you read Ed Snowden's memoir, which is a really good book, he talks about how he had always wanted to work for the government. He came from a military family. And so he's working for, I believe it was the CIA at the time. It was before he went to the NSA. And he was a govy, right? So he was on whatever, like $90,000 a year or something. And the way that the military budget works is their head count is capped, but their spending is not. And so at a certain point, his boss says, you have to go work for IBM. And he's like, but I want to work for the government. And they're like, yeah, IBM will contract you back to us. Go talk to this recruiter because we can only have so many employees. So he goes to the recruiter and the recruiter says, how much money do you make? And he says, $90,000. And the recruiter says, well, that won't do because I get paid 25% of your salary in a commission. We're going to bill you out at $300,000. Right. And then he goes back to his desk under the same boss, now charging $300,000 a year. Like, we know where the waste in government is. And what they're doing is firing all the people who look for waste, right? They're firing all the people who attack beltway bandits. When contractors do highway maintenance, it costs 25% more and takes 25% longer than when federal employees do highway maintenance. And what they're doing is slashing the federal employees and replacing them probably with the same people, but working for a private sector boss. And unlike Ed, they're not going to share the additional revenues with him.
So then is there a future then where in the principles of enshittification where things then become bad for the contractors again? In the way that we talk about these things, right? Because the federal government is so big, they don't have to care.
Yeah, so we do see that where Trump picks favorites, right? This is a classic kind of corruption move, where when you have an environment like a crimogenic environment, where every official and every contractor and every supplier is corrupt and on the take, you can legitimately prosecute or terminate contracts for corruption and incompetence, but you can do so in an illegitimate way. So there's a great piece of empirical work on the corruption purges of Xi Jinping from, I think it was 2013 to 2018, when he was trying to consolidate his power and get another term in office, which has since turned into effectively a lifetime term. And he purged a ton of mid-level provincial officials. And it turns out there's a way to measure how corrupt an official is using empirical metrics, because you can look at like for like regions and then look at these guys who issue business loans and see whether they're issuing business loans that don't pay off the way that the business loans their rivals do. And you can infer from that they're corrupt. And on those metrics, everybody Xi purged was corrupt, but they were all in the power base of his rivals. And all the corrupt officials in his own power base remained intact. So, for example, Verizon just lost a $2 billion communications contract to the federal government.
Right. For the FAA, yes. Which Musk initially said it was Verizon's program that was failing, and it turns out he had that wrong because he's not careful, but then still said, but we're still not going to let Verizon come in with their new thing that we had already said they were going to get, and we're going to use mine instead.
Yeah. So that's the I mean, it's different from how firms do it. I mean, I'm at pains to say that governments are not businesses, and it's a mistake to think that in every way to think that governments act like businesses. I mean, one of the problems we have right now is treating the government like a business, treating the treasury like household finances, right? Like people who mint dollars are not like people who spend dollars. Right, like worrying about how many dollars the U.S. government has is like worrying about how many iTunes gift certificates Apple has.
It's not the same thing,
right? Yeah, worrying about like how many things are for sale in dollars and whether the number of dollars is a good ratio to the number of things for sale in dollars. That's important. Worrying about the dollars themselves is very silly.
Right. It's the way that I talk on this show about debt hawks or deficit hawks, where it's really people don't care. But likening it to a credit card debt is not the same thing. If I default on my credit card debt, it's a very big deal for me, but if no one else. And if the U.S. defaults on the debt, it causes a global economic collapse. It is just not the same thing.
Well, I mean, I think that the important part of this that we haven't talked about quite so much is the opportunity for changes. That once you know what the pathology is, right, then it takes it out of a fairly nihilistic and depressing world of like where the great forces of history made this moment shitty and moves us into the realm of material things, right? Individuals in living memory made policy choices that they were warned would likely lead to this outcome. They did it anyway. They've never faced any accountability. We can hold them to account, and we can also reverse their policies. So the interesting thing about the antitrust surge over this decade really has been that there is no dark money lobby for antitrust, right? The fact that Australia, Canada, China, the EU, France, Germany, Spain, the UK, and the US have all done more on antitrust in like the last 4 years than they did in the previous 40 is not the result like of someone funding a kind of PragerU style propaganda arrangement that makes people do it. It's a genuine popular uprising. And the politics of it are downstream of the public sentiment. And just as with labor law, getting rid of the antitrust agency doesn't get rid of the public sentiment. If anything, it just sharpens it. And, like I said, we are at this moment where Trump is dismantling the system of global trade that America used as both carrot and stick to force other countries to go easy on American firms and even to abet them in extracting rent from the people who lived in those countries. And this is quite an opportunity for a real substantial change. I've been thinking a lot lately about Milton Friedman, my arch nemesis. And Friedman, when people would ask him, how are you going to make your austerian neoliberal economic ideas popular when people really like, retirement and healthcare and libraries, national parks, quality education for their children, the knowledge that no one's starving to death in their town. He would say, in times of crisis, ideas move from the periphery to the center. It's our job to keep the ideas lying around. And the oil crisis was his crisis. It was his moment, because people, in times when they can't pay their bills and their life savings are vaporized, they are willing to entertain big changes, much bigger than at any other time. And Trump is about to do this. Trump is about to make a lot of things a lot more expensive. He's about to create mass shortages around the world, not because, reshoring is a bad idea. Reshoring is a great idea. We just learned through the pandemic how brittle and dangerous this, completely hollowed out system where all the slack has been converted to stock dividends, and even the most minor hiccup just grinds the whole system to a halt. But you just can't do it overnight. And making things more expensive doesn't automatically open factories. Like capital formation and the construction of new firms and new production facilities is a time-consuming process. It took decades in China. And, you can break it down really quick, and they sure did, but you can't just rebuild it overnight. You're not going to reopen the factories of the Rust Belt, much as it would be great if we could. And so I think that in this moment of unscheduled midair rapid disassembly of the global economy, we have an opportunity here, and it will redound to the benefit of Americans, right? If our brothers and sisters abroad can gut the margins of the tech giants and other monopolists who are holding up the S&P 500 and whose windfall profits have been used to destroy the integrity of American politics, that will be good for us too.
So where do we start then? That seems big. It seems like a big task.
I mean, I feel like just talking about this a lot in public in the last couple of weeks has made a lot of has gotten a lot of traction. I've heard from people who are staffers in the EU. I just heard from a Senate staffer who wants to do hearings on this. Lots of Canadian lawmakers. I just had some kind of senior people in one of the Canadian political parties ask me to write a letter about it for party leadership. For me, I feel like me shouting about this is getting something done. There are lots of organizations that are really interested in these kinds of things. And I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I've been there for nearly a quarter of a century. EFF has local affinity groups through the Electronic Frontiers Alliance. If you're listening to this and you're in America, EFA groups are everywhere. You can probably find one in your neighborhood and join up. And I think EFA is going to be working on other issues, not this one, but I think it's all part of it's all of a piece together. This idea that technological self-determination is key to economic reform and to a better, more equal and more resilient society. And so everyone who's working on any aspect of technological self-determination, I think, is contributing.
Yeah. And that'll be in the show notes for listeners who want to get on that. But Corey, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Grant.
Okay. Now it's time for TLTO, or Too Long Tuned Out, where I tell you just the stuff you need to know from the stuff you just heard. Donald Trump has had a whirlwind week of flip-flopping back and forth and doing all these 180 turns, really upending a lot of the things he spent the last 6 weeks doing. Chief among them, Trump has waffled back and forth on tariffs on Canada and Mexico, saying they would go in place, then carving out little bits and then pulling them off altogether, and then today saying he was going to put tariffs back on Canada. It's causing a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear among businesses and employers and employees who are looking for some clarity about how they go forward, as we all are expecting to see prices rise, not just because of the tariffs that may or may not go into place, but because just the idea that they could be there in general is making things more expensive. Trump also did an about-face in two major foreign policy areas. He started saying he might put harmful sanctions on Russia, something that is normally associated with what the European Union, who he said was designed to screw America, and Democrats are more apt to do. He also reached out to Iran to start talks again about making Iran a nuclear power, or at least having the ability to make nuclear energy, something that he said under Obama was one of the worst deals in American history, and that a lot of his supporters, especially his supporters who back Israel, do not want to see happen. And then there are the things in his own administration. Veterans are upset because the VA is going to be cutting 83,000 jobs. A lot of those jobs are jobs held by veterans. A lot of them aren't, but they're going to be doing a 15% cut in a department filled with people that treats people who thought Donald Trump would have their backs. And Donald Trump made his first real big break with Elon Musk, reining in Musk and Doge this week during a fiery cabinet meeting where secretaries got into arguments with Elon Musk, and we're starting to feel how those indiscriminate cuts across the U.S. government are impacting those agencies and the rest of our lives. And all of it means that what Trump has been doing for the last 6 weeks is now hitting head-on with the reality and the consequences of those actions, and there is likely a lot more to come. All right, that is it for today's episode. I want to thank Corey again for coming on the show. You can find links to his work and the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the show notes of this episode, and our full conversation will be out on Monday this week. I've been finding that most people are listening to that long conversation on the Substack on Monday, so that's where you'll find it. And speaking of the Substack, subscribe today. It's got a bunch of bonus content there. I put something out almost every day when I'm not doing the podcast, and it really helps keep Make It Make Sense going. If you don't want to do that, please like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube. Rate and review the podcast or whatever podcast app you listen to this on. And the easiest thing you can do is spread the word about Make It Make Sense on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next week.